Since it launched on the Wii in 2010, Metroid Other M remains the most controversial and divisive entry to the series, although divisive might not be exactly the right word. This game represents one of the increasingly rare instances of everyone more or less universally agreeing on a single point. Other M was just not a very good Metroid game. Now, despite being a huge Metroid fan, Other M until recently was the only game in the series that I never bothered to play, mainly because the immediate negative response it received back in the day from critics and gamers alike. Granted, some of this backlash was honestly unjustified. It seems like many people were simply upset that this new entry was not being developed by Retro Studios, the team behind the very popular and very successful Metroid Prime trilogy. However, it's important to remember that the third and final entry to the Prime series was arguably the worst in the trilogy. It was the only game in the series that appeared natively on the Nintendo Wii, and like most Wii exclusive titles, it relied heavily on the much maligned motion control gimmicks that defined the system. Now, some of these motion controls worked remarkably well, namely the fact that you used the Wii remote to control the on-screen targeting reticule. This mechanic was so well received, in fact, that it was incorporated in the first two Prime games when they eventually got ported to the Wii. And I would argue that, at least right now, the Wii ports of Metroid Prime 1 and 2 are the definitive versions of both those games. Most of the other motion controls were not as welcome, however. Metroid Prime 3 was determined to be as immersive as possible, so the game more or less forced you to be Samus during even the most mundane operations of the game, like unlocking doors, pressing buttons on keypads, and controlling her ship to navigate between worlds. And another addition to Metroid Prime 3 that I didn't appreciate was the addition of side characters. In the past, the Metroid series had utilized side characters very sparingly. For the most part, Samus Aran was completely isolated during the entirety of her missions. By comparison, in Prime 3 she was virtually surrounded by a cast of characters who were there to deliver exposition and drive the plot forward, or just kind of stand around to help create what I'm sure was expected to be a more lived-in world.
I'm sorry, but this requires my full attention.
Oh, and also, every one of them talked. The addition of speaking characters completely changed the tone of Prime 3, and for me at least, not for the better. Fortunately, Samus herself remained as silent and stoic as ever. Metroid Prime 3 has its fans, probably, but for the most part it had a very lukewarm reception. And I'm mentioning all this not to review Prime 3, but just to remind everyone that the game that came before Other M was itself somewhat flawed and divisive, and that maybe it was time to change things up a bit. I imagine this is why, instead of continuing with the Prime series or even that style of game, Other M was more or less a soft reboot of the series. It would abandon the first-person perspective that fans had grown accustomed to in the Prime series, and return to the third-person perspective that the series was more commonly known for. Retro Studios was also replaced by Team Ninja, who were most popular for the Ninja Gaiden series and the Dead or Alive series. Because of all these changes, Metroid Other M had a negative buzz surrounding it before anyone had even played the game. Negative expectations can actually work as an advantage though. Sometimes when you expect the absolute worst from a game and it exceeds those expectations even slightly, it can turn a mediocre experience into a, pretty good one. Unfortunately, this would not be the case with Other M. When it was originally released in 2010, it received mostly positive-ish reviews, generally in the 6 to 8 out of 10 range, but the fan response was far less forgiving. It became immediately apparent that everyone's fears were completely founded. Other M was not the Metroid game we wanted, and it was quickly dismissed as the biggest misstep in the entire series. We wouldn't see another Metroid game until 2017's remake of Metroid 2, and it wasn't until 2021 that we would get a proper sequel with Metroid Dread. Fast forward to 2022, it took me 12 years, but I finally played through Metroid Other M. And now that I played it, I can honestly say, it's fine. It's a great looking game, particularly by Wii standards. Some of the cutscenes look phenomenal, and the in-game graphics are also quite nice. The story sends you through a decent variety of typical Metroid-esque environments, like lush and tangled jungles, volcanic lakes, and frozen caverns. Unfortunately, most of the game is spent running through a seemingly endless network of generic industrial corridors, which softens the visual variety a bit. Despite my initial reservations, I was relieved to find this is still very much a Metroid game, albeit something of a watered-down one. Samus starts the game pretty much fully powered. The weapons and abilities she ends the game with are basically the same ones she starts with. So Other M doesn't follow the typical Metroid formula of doling out weapon and armor upgrades during the course of the game. Although there are plenty of secrets to uncover, exploration is kept to a minimum, and most of the upgrades you collect are simply to extend your life bar and missile capacity. Now, there was a reason why I spent so much time on my criticisms of Metroid Prime 3, and that's because, in spite of what I'm assuming was a deliberate effort to be as different as possible from the Prime series, Other M still managed to make many of the same mistakes, just in radically different ways. Controlling the game is something of a mixed bag. The game requires you to hold the Wii Remote sideways like an NES gamepad, which to begin with is not especially comfortable. Movement is handled by the D-pad, which restricts Samus's movement to the 4 cardinal directions. This isn't really too much of a problem for most of the game, where you can really only run to the left or the right, but it becomes a bit more awkward when you are navigating through one of the game's many open rooms, where you'll likely be wishing for full 360-degree movement. I know the idea was probably to make the user interface a bit more streamlined and accessible, but the control scheme is a bit too simplified for its own good. Samus's controls are limited to a scant number of buttons. By comparison, the first 2 Prime games used every single button on the GameCube controller, and every function felt necessary. I'll concede that scaling back the controls isn't a terrible idea, but the variety of moves that Samus has at her disposal beg for a more elaborate control scheme than the one we got. As a result, some of her moves were relegated to motion control purgatory. You fire missiles by swinging the controller forward and aiming it at the TV screen, which awkwardly switches your perspective to a static first-person view. You recharge health and missiles by holding the Wii Remote vertically, like a lightsaber. There seems to be a fine line between streamlining the control scheme and outright restricting it, and boxing in the user interface this way takes the basic functions of Samus's character, which have always been so fluid and intuitive in the previous games, and makes them needlessly awkward, and complicated, and weird, and off-putting, and other negative words. However, this isn't the biggest issue Other M has. My main complaint with the game is the same as everyone else's, and it has nothing to do with the gameplay. Other M was written and directed by Yoshio Sakamoto, who has been heavily involved in the Metroid series from the beginning. He directed Super Metroid and wrote and directed Metroid Fusion and Zero Mission. Now, it's generally understood that the Metroid series as a whole, for whatever reason, is more popular around the world than it is in Japan. This may explain why, for Metroid Prime, Nintendo was comfortable handing the reins of the series to Texas-based Retro Studios, which was a gamble that ultimately paid off, as Metroid Prime is now one of the most successful games in the series, outselling all 3 of the games that came before it. Once again being in control of the series that he helped create, Sakamoto seemed to have seen this as his chance to make the Metroid series appealing to everyone, not just to players on the other side of the world. In a 2010 interview shortly before Other M's release, Sakamoto had this to say.
I have to say that we're thinking globally. We want to drive the elements that people have really attached fondness to in the Metroid series. And so we're actively looking to find out what people want. But we're not just thinking about the ideas of gamers in Japan. We're definitely thinking about everyone.
Now, this is a bit of presumption on my part, but when he says he's looking to find out what people want, I believe what he's saying is that he is laser focused on the Japanese market. The Metroid series is already successful in other parts of the world, so he doesn't need to find out what they want. The tightrope he's attempting to walk here is making just enough changes to the series to attract one audience without alienating the audience that actually makes the series profitable. The simplified, more accessible control scheme is likely a byproduct of this new approach, as was the heavier emphasis on story. Sakamoto also wanted to focus on Samus Aran as a character, to expand on her personality and reintroduce her to audiences. Again, not just in Japan, but around the world. Except he really means just in Japan. And this is where things start to go a little sideways. For starters, I don't need anyone to tell me who Samus Aran is. I already know. Samus Aran as a character is in her late 30s to mid 40s. She has kind of a dry, sarcastic sense of humor. She likes to argue. She likes Mega Man. You see where I'm going with this, right? Samus Aran is a typical silent protagonist. She's not really meant to be a character in any real sense. She's supposed to be kind of a blank slate. She's basically just a vessel through which you, the player, experience the game. That being said, this has not stopped Samus from developing something of a character over the years, probably more so than even more popular characters like Mario and Link, purely from players projecting onto her expected and implied character traits. Let's briefly tally up all the things we know about Samus Aran, purely based on what has been specifically shown to us or what can be reasonably inferred from the games. Since Other M bridges the gap between Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion, I'm only going to be focusing on these 4 games. I'm not sure how the Prime trilogy fits into the timeline, so we're going to ignore it for the time being. First of all, we know that Samus Aran is a bounty hunter. Now, historically, one of the roles bounty hunters have played is capturing wanted criminals and bringing them to justice. Now, Samus may do that stuff also, but we've never actually seen her do it. We've only seen her be the type of bounty hunter who kills things, presumably for money. So from that, we can logically infer that she's brave, independent, because we always see her working alone, and she wouldn't be a very good bounty hunter if she weren't a bit, morally fluid. In Metroid 2, she was unable to bring herself to kill the baby Metroid, even though it was her job to completely destroy the species. This one act gave her just the slightest little heartbeat, just a brief glimpse of her humanity and her compassion. And what did she do next? She didn't keep it as a pet, she literally donated it to science. Hey, did you ever read The Plague Dogs? Really powerful, emotional story about 2 dogs that are escaping a medical research center. And let me tell you, if you love dogs, you might want to skip that one. Even so, the baby Metroid bonds with Samus as its mother, and at the end of Super Metroid, it sacrifices itself to save her from Mother Brain. Metroid Fusion fleshes out Samus's character a bit more through a series of text-only dictation crawls, during which she acknowledges that the baby Metroid saved her life, but she doesn't really dwell on that too much. She also frequently reminisces about her former commanding officer, Adam Malkovich. She also says multiple times that she does not like taking orders, which is backed up by her actions late in the game when she deliberately defies orders and does what she thinks she should do, not what she's being told to do. And I just want to cut back to Metroid Prime 3 real quick. Now, as I said, Samus is completely silent in the game, but the other characters are not, including the 3 other bounty hunters that she is partnered up with at the beginning of the game. Now, one of these bounty hunters seems to have developed kind of an infatuation with Samus, and at one point, he says this.
Hey, relax, we're the good guys. Justice will prevail and all that stuff. Right, Samus?
You know, I've always hated that part. Pull yourself together, man. You are a bounty hunter, a mercenary for hire. You should have no concept being a good guy or a bad guy. You are simply being paid to be there to do your job. And to her credit, Samus seems to see it the same way I do, because not too long after that conversation, she kills him. And because there's no follow-up cutscene to show us how sad and remorseful she is, I have to assume she's not. I mentioned earlier that despite being a Japanese developed series, Metroid has always been more popular with Western audiences. And I honestly believe that we might have a greater understanding of her character than Yoshio Sakamoto. And this could not be made any clearer than everyone's reactions to how Samus was portrayed in Other M. Other M's version of Samus is meek and submissive and passive. She unexpectedly meets up with Adam Malkovich early in the game and immediately submits to his authority. Samus is more powerful than any of the Galactic soldiers, and thus can solve pretty much all of their problems before the game even really starts. So naturally, Malkovich orders her to deactivate all the powers of her suit.
You don't move unless I say so, and you don't fire until I say so.
Understood, Adam. No objections, of course.
This, by the way, is how Other M addresses the standard mechanic of Samus starting the game underpowered and then slowly gaining abilities over the course of the game. Samus doesn't acquire these by skill or ingenuity. Malkovich authorizes her to reactivate her existing powers one at a time. Samus is so committed to Malkovich's authority that she willfully keeps her various systems in deactivation even at risk of her own life.
Samus, activate the Varia feature on your suit to protect yourself from heat damage.
During the multiple cutscenes that she shares with Adam and the soldiers, Samus just kind of stands silently and uncomfortably in the background, like a shy new kid in school, just waiting for someone to notice her. There are very few times when she acts assertively, and time again, she is rescued by the other characters from situations I know full well she can handle. And yet we're supposed to believe that this is the same character who also single-handedly saved the galaxy on at least 3 other occasions. Samus begins narrating the game to us within the first few seconds of the game, and for the entirety of the game we are privy to her thoughts. We learn about her crippling insecurity. She is ashamed of her past and desperate for Adam's approval.
I wondered what Adam thought of me.
And then there's the baby Metroid. The goddamn baby Metroid. Now, in Metroid Fusion, which chronologically takes place after Other M, and is the only other game in the series in which Samus offers any insight into what she thought of the baby Metroid, she refers to it almost coldly as the hatchling. She briefly acknowledges that she owes it her life, not with any kind of maternal reverence, but because, she appreciates not being dead. To Other M's version of Samus, however, the baby Metroid was everything.
Never again would I encounter the baby. The baby. The baby. Baby. I remembered the baby. Baby's cry. The baby. The baby was the last of its kind. And the baby. The baby remained on me. Baby's cry. It was as though it was crying specifically for me.
To be clear, the baby Metroid and the general concept of motherhood actually do have some significance to the story. There is a mother-daughter relationship that is brought up later in the game that's probably meant to mirror Samus's relationship to the baby Metroid. But this falls a bit flat because Samus's intense devotion to the Metroid not only does not feel earned, it is outright contradicted by the other games. At no point does it ever stop feeling out of character. I have one more final example to just kind of drive this point home. There's an encounter with Ridley in the last half of the game. Now remember that at this point, Samus has defeated this enemy on at least 2 other occasions, but this time she has a complete panic attack. The game goes out of its way to show us how traumatic this encounter is to her by literally showing Samus cowering in terror as a little girl. If you've played any other game in the series, you tell me how accurately this scene represents the character of Samus Aran. Now, in any other context, all this makes for a very interesting character. Whether it's in video games, movies, or literature, we see ourselves in flawed and broken characters. It's easier to identify and empathize with a character when we see them struggle with familiar internal conflicts like fear, sadness, insecurity, and anger. But a character's relatability is easily broken when we simply don't understand why they feel the way they do. This story would have worked better as a full origin story for Samus Aran. It could have been interesting to see her grow from a fearful and insecure young woman into the fearless mercenary we see her as in the other games. But the story elements of Other M rely too much on events that we've already seen happen. And within the context of Samus fighting Ridley and Mother Brain and discovering the baby Metroid, we've already seen her behave in a way that was not this. In other words, it was too late in the series for Sakamoto to rewrite her character this way. He may have been trying to make Metroid more palatable to the Japanese market, but in a way this was his admission that the character of Samus Aran had gotten away from him. It could even be argued that Samus was no longer his character to make these changes to. And even if no one actually said these words to him, the outright rejection of his game and his version of Samus almost certainly did. Since Other M, Sakamoto seems to have taken a less hands-on approach to the Metroid series. He still stands as the series producer, but actual development of the past 2 games has been handled by the Spanish developer Mercury Steam. Metroid Dread, the latest game in the series and the first core entry to the series since Other M, has Samus back in her unaltered form. In fact, she's possibly even more westernized here than ever before. And to date, Metroid Dread is the only game in the series to have outsold the original Metroid Prime. A case can certainly be made that this is because Samus is once again back in the hands of Western writers and developers. And maybe going forward into whatever the future has in store for the Metroid series, that's the way it's meant to be.